The title is the topic. Today I'm talking about hiding laziness.
Welcome to the third episode in our multi-part series exploring the roles and representations of feminist frequency. This project examines the tropes, plot devices, and patterns most commonly associated with I'm Anita Keesian from a systemic, big-picture perspective.
I already did 2 videos on this topic.
So if you haven't seen it yet, please check that one out before continuing to watch this one.
Let's return to that section I was saving, the current scope of the project. The goals of feminist frequency have changed due to all these factors. Here's an overview of the ways we have evolved and expanded the Tropes vs. Women in Video Game project. Instead of examining a handful of examples for each trope, we sift through hundreds of games across a variety of genres and platforms. For example, we referenced 182 games in our coverage of the damsel in distress trope alone. Let's examine that number. 182 games referenced in damsels in distress. If you go to the YouTube video Damsel in Distress Part 3, the number actually reads 183 total games shown in the 3-part miniseries. Then, if you follow the link to her website, it says Damsel in Distress Trope Series by the numbers. Number of episodes, 3. Games referenced, 192. With 182, 183, and 192, she has 3 different sets of numbers for how many games are referenced between all 3 damsel in distress videos.
Studied extensively.
I was aware of this discrepancy since I started reviewing her videos, so I gave her the benefit of the doubt and counted the 192 number. We have also cataloged and documented over 548 examples of the damsel in distress throughout the history of video games. Next issue I have here. She does mention the Tumblr blog in all 3 video descriptions as I'm showing you right now. However, there is no number there. I couldn't recall if I had seen that blog at first till I clicked on it. So the question might be, why didn't I mention it in my reviews? It is called jumping through hoops. I shouldn't have to go through so many hoops to find these games, or get a more accurate number. She was paid to make videos and present her arguments in the videos, so I went off the numbers she presented in the description. She did say this.
Throughout the 80s and 90s, the trope became so prevalent that it would be nearly impossible to mention them all.
So you mean to tell me there is no possible way you could have presented a bigger list of games in a short time frame?
Not to mention the myriad of other mobile games for tablets and smartphones which recycle the excuse plot ad nauseum.
There are plenty of ways you could have presented those games, but by making it a generalized statement...
Throughout the 80s and 90s, the trope became so prevalent that it would be nearly impossible to mention them all.
She can always defer to something like a Tumblr site. You know, so she can add games at her leisure instead of having them all documented when her videos were first released. It allows her to inflate her numbers at a later date, which I'm about to demonstrate. I have been hammering the less than 1% of games argument since I posted my first review on November 11th last year. Now Anita is finally giving us bigger numbers up front instead of making us jump through hoops. However, I want to quote something from my first review. This next clip sums up the biggest issue I have with the way Anita defines her research.
Throughout the 80s and 90s, the trope became so prevalent that it would be nearly impossible to mention them all.
Claiming they exist does not prove you actually researched it. I suspected the day may come when you try to cover your tracks by inflating your numbers. I worded that line specifically for you. And I also said this.
The pattern of presenting women when women are continuously portrayed, widely used gendered cliches.
Patterns of presenting women, continuously portrayed, widely used. I don't see one thing in any of your research to substantiate any of those claims. It is on you to prove your claims to be true at the time you make them. Again, that line was also worded specifically for you. And I still stand by those statements. Why is this important?
Welcome to our multi-part video series exploring the roles and representations of women in video games. This project will examine the tropes, plot devices, and patterns most commonly associated with women in gaming from a systemic, big-picture perspective.
Your first video said a systemic big picture perspective. Because you are the one who started your video series with such a broad, encompassing statement, it is on you to prove those claims to be true at the time you make them, and it is on you to present your evidence at the time you make those claims.
Studied extensively.
Having said that, I also said this in my third review of your Damsel in Distress series. You intentionally word your arguments so any potential counter-argument can't be used. Since I am critiquing your work, I am now a critic myself, and your rules do not apply to me. I refuse to play by your rules any longer. I'm playing by my rules. Now that I'm going through this Tumblr site, I will begin by pointing out your first video was uploaded on March 7th, 2013. That is the first time you said this in a video.
From a systemic, big picture perspective.
If you claimed it was big picture and systemic back then, I will only count games on your Tumblr site that were posted at that time you made that claim. It does not matter how many games you have on that list. It could be 10,000 for all I care. It is on you to provide the games to prove your claims at the time you make them. Fortunately for me, you have this little archive that lists when the games were posted. Being your Kickstarter was funded on June 16th, 2012, that gave you almost 9 months to do your research. I noticed that the Tumblr site started documenting games on January 2013 with 142 games. Over 6 months into your project that was supposed to be complete by the end of 2012, and you only had 142 documented games.
Studied extensively.
That is less than all the games in all your videos combined, assuming you know the precise number, since you didn't even get that right. Then in February, there are 106 entries, and in March, 20. That is a total of 268 games. I will cross-reference that with the numbers I had in my first video review, 27,082. It is still less than 1% of every game ever made.
From a systemic, big picture perspective.
You made that claim based on less than 1% of every game ever made, according to your revised numbers that I allowed you to have. Isn't it odd how lazy Anita seems when you don't play by her rules? Now let's look at all your videos combined. Your third video was released on August 1st, 2013. Going back to your Tumblr site, by August, you had documented 341 games. Compared to my 27,082 games, that is 1.2% of every game I found. So you barely made it over the 1% mark by the time you were done with the Damsel in Distress videos.
From a systemic, big picture perspective.
It's too bad you said it was a big picture systemic issue, because that puts more of a burden on you. If you had stuck to your original goal of a handful of game examples from major titles, I wouldn't have to school you with math. You wouldn't have to document all these games. You wouldn't have to prove how big picture it is. In other words, the only one to blame for this math competition is yourself.
Studied extensively.
And with 1.2% of games, according to your numbers, you never proved it was big picture or systemic, so you never should have claimed it. Now let me explain something else. With 341 games on her list by August of 2013, and her new number of 548 examples, she has added over 200 more games since her last Damsel in Distress video. I don't actually have any issue with you documenting more examples, but you didn't provide enough at the time you made the claim. Even if I give you that 548 number, which you've added to for over 2 years, it is still only 2%.
From a systemic, big picture perspective.
No matter how much you inflate this number, it is a fact you never proved it at the time you made the claim. On top of that, I stopped my numbers at 27,082 because I don't have the time to do it like you do. All I am is just some guy on the internet with a day job and no Kickstarter, and I am up against someone who can raise $158,000 for her research.
As you might imagine, this project requires an enormous amount of research. This is an incredibly ambitious project because of the scope and scale of the research and production involved.
I actually raised 25 times what I initially asked for.
And your research is lazy.
Studied extensively.
Now that Anita is being called out on her numbers, she is showcasing new numbers to hide what is being pointed out, and she will continue to inflate that list of hers to make her weak arguments seem stronger than they really are. In my first video review, I found this. 2 lists of every game ever made. One has it at over 43,000 entries, and the other at over 91,000 entries. Even if Anita keeps inflating her list, she has a long way to go to prove it is a big picture systemic issue.
From a systemic, big picture perspective.
Next up, you worded the damsel in distress like this.
Let's take a quick moment to clear up some common misconceptions about this trope. As a plot device, the damsel in distress is often grouped with other separate tropes, including the designated victim, the heroic rescue, and the smooch of victory. However, it's important to remember that these associated conventions are not necessarily a part of the damsel in distress trope itself. So the woman in question may or may not play the victim role for the entire game or series, while our brave hero may or may not be successful in his rescue attempt. All that is really required to fulfill the damsel in distress trope is for a female character to be reduced to a state of helplessness from which she requires rescuing by a typically male hero for the benefit of his story arc.
By saying that, you can call whatever you want a damsel in distress game. Going back to your list, Webby, DuckTales 2. According to the game description for DuckTales 2, after all 5 main stages are cleared,
so the woman in question may or may not play the victim role for the entire game or series.
Webby is kidnapped by Glomgold and held for ransom on the pirate ship in the Bermuda Triangle.
All that is really required to fulfill the damsel in distress trope is for a female character to be reduced to a state of helplessness from which she requires rescuing by a typically male hero.
So she isn't even a damsel the whole game, just toward the end. Whereas most damsel in distress games, the damsel is usually taken at the beginning and the main purpose is to rescue her. But given Anita's little technicalities, it is now on her list. It may be a damsel in distress game, but Anita said this herself.
Just to be clear, I'm not saying that all games that use the damsel in distress as a plot device are automatically sexist or have no value. Of course, there is absolutely nothing wrong with offering or occasionally needing assistance.
Being Webby is only kidnapped toward the end of the game, she wasn't a damsel the whole game. If I'm not mistaken, this falls under the criteria of what Anita considers acceptable.
Just to be clear, I'm not saying that all games that use the damsel in distress as a plot device are automatically sexist or have no value. Of course, there is absolutely nothing wrong with offering or occasionally needing assistance.
However, since she was technically a damsel, it is now on Anita's list. I also found games with descriptions like these. Various Women, Red Dead Redemption. Various Women, Ride to Hell, Retribution. Unnamed Women, Sonic Blastman. This means Anita can call whatever she wants a damsel and add it to her list, thus inflating her numbers even more, even if they are just various and unnamed women.
Studied extensively.
I did, however, discover one little item on her list. This isn't really part of my arguments, just an observation. It is confirmed. Anita is in fact a damsel in a game called Johnny Bazooka Tone.
You're probably doing something right if you're being called a white knight.
To all the white knights out there, you can now fulfill your fantasy of rescuing Anita whenever you please. One more thing about this 548 games number. Let me ask you some questions.
Fundamentally weak, ineffective, or ultimately incapable as frail, fragile, and vulnerable creatures.
With your new games, have you cross-referenced that statement with all of your new numbers? Are all the new damsels on your list fundamentally weak, ineffective, or ultimately incapable as frail, fragile, and vulnerable creatures?
Now and then damseled characters may be well written, funny, dynamic, or likable.
Are they well written, funny, dynamic, and likable, or are they part of a lazy justification?
The hero's fight to retrieve his stolen property then provides the lazy justification for the actual gameplay.
Those talking points could be debated ad nauseum. So let me play one more clip.
The dark and edgy trope cocktails that we've discussed in this episode are not isolated incidents or obscure anomalies. Instead, they represent an ongoing, recurring pattern in modern gaming narratives. In most cases, the damseled characters have simply gone from being helpless to being dead, which is obviously not a huge improvement from her perspective.
You said in Damsel in Distress Part 2, in most cases, the the damseled characters have gone from being helpless to being dead, at least when it comes to more modern games.
In most cases, the damseled characters have simply gone from being helpless to being dead.
Given that you have added over 200 new games to your list since you made that statement, I want to ask you, did you go through all the games released in that time frame you were referencing to confirm that statement? Let's breeze through the rest of this so we can get to the end. Originally, I anticipated creating 10 to 12 minute episodes for each trope. However, as the depth and breadth of our analysis grew, so did the videos. The Damsel in Distress became a 3-part miniseries, clocking in at just over 1 hour. Ms. Male character was 25 minutes long. Women as Background Decoration became a 2-part miniseries, clocking in at 1 hour. All I read was you just wasted 2 years of your life and $158,000 from almost 7,000 backers so you could craft arguments into your videos that are now full of holes.
Studied extensively.
Our desire to be more specific in the analysis meant that we made connections to other related tropes, including some that we identified and named ourselves. For example, in the Damsel in Distress videos, we also discussed new tropes such as the helpful damsel, the damsel in the refrigerator, the disposable damsel, and the euthanized damsel. With all that and more, it's easy to see how we ended up with an hour-long, multi-part series just on this one topic alone. You made up your own tropes. You, however, said this.
Let's take a quick moment to clear up some common misconceptions about this trope. As a plot device, the damsel in distress is often grouped with other separate tropes. All that is really required to fulfill the damsel in distress trope is for a female character to be reduced to a state of helplessness, from which she requires rescuing by a typically male hero.
Since these trope combinations are other separate tropes, and all she needs to do is be reduced to a state of helplessness from which she requires rescuing from a typical male hero, you spent the better part of a year on the Damsel in Distress videos, in part, to make something up that you defined as not being a part of the trope itself.
As a plot device, the damsel in distress is often grouped with other separate tropes.
If you had stuck to your original plan of 10 to 12 minute videos with a brief 101 style analysis, you would have been done by now. Instead, you decided you'd rather make things up. You literally say in the videos, you made them up yourself.
Which I called the damsel in the refrigerator. I like to call this happy little gem the euthanized damsel. As a plot device, the damsel in distress is often grouped with other separate tropes. How can a fridged woman still be in distress? Since by definition, being fridged usually sort of requires being dead. This usually happens when the player character must murder the woman in peril for her own good. All that is really required to fulfill the damsel in distress trope is for a female character to be reduced to a state of helplessness, from which she requires rescuing by a typically male hero.
All I read was you just wasted 2 years of your life and $158,000 from almost 7,000 backers so you could make things up.
Studied extensively.
Many of my previous videos were off the cuff and only half scripted. In this series, I have become much more intentional. Every sentence and every word is carefully considered and evaluated. There is nothing flippity or casually stated. This can lead to hours of discussion about the accuracy of a particular term or rephrasing a single sentence until it is just right. Rather than small casual analysis, each trope video has ended up feeling like we are trying to put together a master thesis in just a few months. You raised several times more than your asking amount.
I actually raised 25 times what I initially asked for.
And you were already producing content at least some people considered acceptable.
Feminist frequency videos have been used in middle school, high school, and university classrooms. They've been integrated into the curriculum of media studies, gender studies, and law school programs. Parents have even reached out to me saying that they used my videos to spark discussions with their kids about representations of women in the media.
All I read was you just wasted 2 years of your life and $158,000 from almost 7,000 backers so you could waste money and time.
Studied extensively.
The original schedule was to have all her videos done by the end of 2012, and overcomplicating her videos with ridiculous arguments is more important than the backers that invested money in her Tropes versus Women in Video Games series. If you like this video, I have a playlist tackling Anita Sarkeesian and her work, and encourage you to check it out. It also includes reviews of her Tropes vs. Women in Video Games series.
I get a lot of support from people who really like my videos, and they've even been used as educational tools in classrooms. Educational tools.
I leave my audience with one question.
Oh, did I win?